This week, we'll discuss American sociologist C. Wright Mills and his influential book, The Sociological Imagination. Specifically, our reading for this week is a PDF located under the Week 1 file folder, under the Week 1 module, and also under the announcement for Week 1. You can locate it under the file title Mills 1959. So the book, The Sociological Imagination, again, was extremely influential, published in 1959, and we're reading the first chapter, The Promise, which is essentially the promise of sociology. What do sociologists do? Again, I specifically designed this lecture for those of you who are not sociology majors, but it's also always good for sociology majors to return to the fundamentals of our discipline. One other note before we get into the lecture: if you refer to the left column on Canvas and look under discussions, you'll see the first assignment for the semester. So the discussion forum for this week is related to today's reading, today's lecture on the sociological imagination. It's 10 questions. Um, Make them fairly brief. You don't. This isn't designed to be a killer assignment. It's just designed to encourage participation. And at some point, I hope that we have some dialogue between you and your classmates. So again, don't think that this has to be, like a research paper or anything like that. Just respond to the prompts as quickly and as spontaneously as possible. They're designed for us to start thinking sociologically. And I'll actually review the questions later on in today's presentation. So again, I don't go overboard with the responses. And the way I'd like for you to respond to them is just there's 10 prompts. Just put a number one, respond, number two, respond, that kind of thing. All right, moving on to today's lecture. Now, this is something that I've done in class over the years. It's a little unusual to do this in this format, but I'll talk through it. So here we see one piece of a puzzle. We're like, so what is this? This is how I usually do this lesson in class. I ask the students, what is this? And they're like, okay, it's a jigsaw puzzle piece. But beyond that, what is it? Given the limited information, how do we fill in the rest of the picture? So it's a solid color, it's orange. But other than that, we don't have a lot of information. But if we were to imagine it, maybe we'd think, okay, let's something solid, maybe those rolly plastic chairs in HSS. Maybe it's an orange car. Maybe it has something to do with UT volunteers. There's a number of things it could be. But the point is, we don't have a lot to go off of. But our mind is doing this all the time. We're always given a little piece of the puzzle, and we're trying to fill in the blanks. So if you think back to your first day on campus as a freshman or a transfer student, you might have been a little confused about where the buildings are, where the classes are, but for the most part, you knew how to navigate the university system, even though you're a freshman. You've been conditioned through your engagement with a social institution of education since kindergarten or perhaps preschool. So you've been taught what the whole school system is all about, even though you had never stepped foot into a classroom at the University of Tennessee. So you locate the building, you find your classroom, you walk in, you pretty much know what's expected of you. You have this little sliver of reality, this puzzle piece, and you're filling in the blanks. You're like, okay, students sit here. The instructor is going to be at the head of the class, behind the podium. This is all spontaneous. This is something that you've internalized throughout most of your lives, right? And most of the time, this serves us good. We don't have to be taught every step of what it means to be, in this case, a student every day. That would be extremely inefficient. We are social beings. We've been conditioned through our engagement with social institutions throughout our lives. So, just a quick note, and we're going to return to this point. What is a social institution? I've mentioned it a few times on this slide, specifically in regards to education. So, social institutions are these large external forces that exist prior to us being born, and they shape who we are. So, education has shaped who we are, the family has shaped who we are, religion, even if we're not religious, has shaped who we are, politics, the economy, and the big one for us, media. So, we're all being created and recreated through our engagement with these large social institutions. You see this? So, this is called a structural approach. So, for our class, we can use the word institution and structure interchangeably. Okay, now there's some slight differences that we get into sometimes in my theory courses, but for our purposes, we can, for the most part, use those terms interchangeably. So when we see social structure, these are large external structures that structure our lives, very intuitively labeled. All right, so back to this puzzle piece. Yeah, we, through our engagement with the social institution of education, our lives have been structured in such a way that we're filling in the missing pieces of the puzzle and probably doing it quite well. But what happens when we are given a little bit of information from, let's say, the media regarding politics? Okay, we start filling in the pieces, right? And sometimes that could work, but oftentimes it leads to distortions. So I started this lesson in 2020, just before COVID. It was like one of my last courses or last class sessions before we went online. And there had been this um, gun rights activist demonstration in the Virginia Capitol around that time. So that's where this image comes from, to the left, you see. Now I'm going to read this quote to the right, and don't overthink it. Don't think about this as a trick question, but the more spontaneously and honest we are with ourselves, the better this lesson will be. So I'm going to read this to you. And as you're hearing this quote, think, was this a Republican or a Democrat? I don't think that loaded guns is a way to solve a problem that should be solved between people of goodwill. And anyone who would approve of this kind of demonstration must be out of their mind. Again, since this is asynchronous, we're not having the interaction that I would like here, so I'm just going to answer the way that most students answer. Well, this sounds like a Democrat. Why? Because Democrats tend to be the party of gun control, and this sounds like a politician who's advocating gun control. When in fact, not only was it a Republican, but it was Ronald Reagan. So if you know anything about Ronald Reagan, he's pretty much the politician that most Republicans aspire to. And he's sort of this conservative icon, right? So why in the world would a conservative Republican advocate for gun reform? And it wasn't just rhetoric. Look at here. He actually signs into law a bill that prohibits the demonstration of loaded guns in public spaces. See that? Specifically the state capitol, which is what we just saw on the previous slide. So now our puzzle is kind of jumbled up, right? I know what Republicans stand for in regards to gun control. They're opposed to it. I know what Democrats stand for in terms of gun control. They're in favor of it. So why is it here we see a conservative Republican politician advocating and indeed signing into law gun control legislation? Well, it was because these guys were the ones demonstrating with guns at the Capitol in Sacramento, right? So the point of all of this is, even though we're constantly given just a small piece of the puzzle, and oftentimes that's enough, we could fill in the other parts to get the full picture. At other times, things are complicated, and we need to recontextualize that piece with the broader picture. That's where the sociological imagination comes in. So, again, like just following up, in 2020, Donald Trump claimed in a tweet that Democrats in Virginia are a threat to gun owner rights, as thousands of pro gun activists arrived in Richmond to rally against proposed crackdowns. So here's his tweet. The Democratic Party and the great Commonwealth of Virginia are working hard to take away your Second Amendment rights. This is just the beginning. Don't let it happen. Vote Republican in 2020. So once again, our puzzle's just all a mess. So how do we put it all back together? So we saw that in regards to contextualizing it with history. So what was going on in Sacramento that led a conservative Republican to um, advocate for gun control? The Black Panther Party. So then suddenly we're starting to get the context, and we understand why it is conservatives went along with it. They felt that the Black Panther Party were a threat, that they were terrorists, that they were violent, they were communist, all the anti-American things that scare tactics and politics lead to. Now, once again, the scare tactic thing is just integral to politics. Like, this class is very, very politically loaded, but it's not a class in which we're being indoctrinated into a perspective. We're trying to get to the bottom of things, like we just did. Like, this isn't to say that Reagan was right or wrong in the action he took, but we have to understand how it is that people who consider themselves conservative Republicans went along with this, you see? And so the ideology kicks in, and I've tried this, with Republican friends of mine, and they'll make all sorts of excuses. I've heard people tell me that California is really liberal, and so the liberals, forced his hand, things like that. So the program has been downloaded, and whenever they're prompted with something that is in violation to what they know as reality, they start to try to figure out excuses to achieve psychic equilibrium. And that doesn't make anyone, you know, dumb or something like that. C. Wright Mills is going to help us in that area. This just makes us human. Okay, so real briefly, particularly for those of you who are new to sociology, sociology is the systematic study of modern society. Now, in other classes, I spend a long time on that definition, particularly my theory courses. The theory courses, that's basically the theme of the entire semester, is trying to wrap our minds around that definition, particularly the word modern. What do we mean by modern? Now, it's important in every class of mine, but I'm not going to spend so much time talking about what I mean by modern or modernity. Those of you who have had me before know that I'll often use that word interchangeably with bourgeois society, but I don't want to kind of veer off course. So let's stick with modern society for this class. And modern society doesn't mean contemporary society. Like, everything that is contemporary is modern, but not everything that's modern is contemporary. In other words, we tend to think about modern in purely technological terms. I have a smartphone. I'm taking a class online. That's modern. Well, sure, it's modern, but so are those powdered wig guys who founded the United States, the founding fathers. They're modern as well. So that kind of messes with us. That's the point of all those videos on our week 1 module about the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment was a major transformation in thought. People start to adhere to science. Suddenly, the world is amenable to human understanding. The absolute authority of the church begins to erode. Society becomes secular. And we see the rise of technology and science in the form of the Industrial Revolution. So the ideas of the Enlightenment, which are subjective in your head, intangible, lead to an objective material transformation of society in the course of industrialization. So sociology is born out of the crucible of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So the ideas of the Enlightenment are the principles on which we understand our modern society. American society was founded upon the principles of the Enlightenment. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We go to France, it's liberty, equality, fraternity. But there's a big one, big one. Freedom. Freedom is the order of the day in a way that is unprecedented in human history. So the promise of freedom is what underpins all of our values, beliefs, and indeed politics. So when we see a contradiction between our values, namely freedom, and what's happening in the real world, then we have a social problem. And that's something that sociologists are chiefly concerned with. So that's more or less all I have to say about modern in this class. I'll return to it, obviously, from time to time, but I'm not going to spend as much time as I do in 310, and certainly not as long as I do in 321. So back to just orthodox sociology. The focus is how individuals interact within groups, how societies are structured, how cultural norms and values shape behavior. So pretty intuitive stuff. And the purpose is to gain insights into the complexities of social life and forces influencing interaction. I had mentioned social institutions earlier. So here's a list of the ones that are most commonly referenced in sociology: the family, religion, education, as we just mentioned, media, law, politics, and the economy. These are macro level social forces that structure our lives. All right, so introducing C. Wright Mills, the thinker of the week. So he was born in Waco, Texas. He earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then he worked at an Ivy League. And this, really shaped a lot of his not only insights but his concerns. So he says the sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relation between the two within society. So we're going to break down what he means by history and biography. Hopefully you've done the reading. It's been posted for about a month on Canvas. But if you haven't, like kind of a word of advice whenever you read older like theory, even though this isn't particularly old, this is in the contemporary moment. 1959 sounds old to you, but it's in the grand scheme of things not that old. But he's very much informed by older thinkers, older bourgeois thinkers. So words like history and biography are used a little bit differently by thinkers like Mills than how we use it in everyday language. But we'll get to that in a moment. So again, 3 components form the sociological imagination. As I just mentioned, history. So this isn't like history necessarily like what you take, in a world history course at UT. This is specifically about the composition of the society that you live in, how a society came to be, and how it is changing. So let's say we're doing a study, a sociological study on racial inequality. Well, first we'd have to ask, well, where? That's very, very important for the sociological imagination because it's important for context. If we're going to do a study on social inequality in Scandinavia, it would be a very different research design than the one that we would do, say, here in the United States or specifically in Tennessee, East Tennessee. You can keep narrowing the scope, and it's going to shape what it is we need to know about the history of that place. So here in Tennessee, we would have to know that about the history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of segregation, of the civil rights movement, on and on and on. That's what he means by history. It's not totally different than what we tend to think of as history, but it's operating at a slightly different register. And then biography. What kind of people inhabit a particular society? So if we were talking about Scandinavia, there's ethnically and racially is far more homogenous than the United States, specifically the Southeast, right? So we'd have to, if we're doing a study in Georgia, for example, Georgia, I believe, demographers out here could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the first state in the US to have a white minority. So that's what he means by biography, right? So we have to take into consideration the groups of people that are represented in a particular society. And then finally, social structure, which we had mentioned, how the institutional orders in a society operate, which ones are dominant, and how they are held together. We'll get back to that one in more detail in a moment. C. Wright Mills tells us the sociological imagination gives the one possessing it the ability to look beyond their local environment and personality to a wider perspective, which considers the relationship between history, biography, and social structure. This is a process that I sometimes refer to as a feedback loop. So we've spent a lot of time in sociology trying to distinguish our discipline from psychology. And those of us who were born and raised in the United States have a hyper individualistic perspective, which lends itself more to a psychological perspective than a sociological one. We tend to think about our individual self as being kind of unique, right? There's some kind of essential quality to being Grady. I would be the same person, had I was born in a place called Forks, Washington. I'd be the same person if I were born in Tokyo or Sao Paulo. That kind of thing. But that's very, very unsociological or non-sociological. Sociologists are like, no, we're very much the product of our environment, the product of social institutions that structure our lives. Right? Think about this. Like, how much different would it be if I were, born in Bangladesh than had I been born in, say, Tennessee? That should be pretty clear. And then also the other things we would think about is, our family's wealth, those kind of opportunities that are afforded to us, race, gender, on and on and on. This is going to shape who we are in a very profound way. Well, we really state that and perhaps overstate it, particularly in these intro classes, just to make sure that we are thinking sociologically at the macro level. But we are individuals as well. We concede that. So that's why this graphic to the right shows an overlap. So there's an interaction going on. So sure, we're the products of our society, but we're also making that society. So the types of people that inhabit a particular society, the biography, is in turn shaping the history of that place even though that history is shaping those the biography of the people. And all of this is interacting, as I said, kind of in this feedback loop. So we are individuals and we are shaped by society, but we do shape society. Otherwise, there would be no such thing as social change. All right, so I pulled some direct quotes from the reading. C. Wright Mills tells us nowadays people often feel that their private lives are a series of traps. They sense that within their everyday worlds they cannot overcome their troubles. And in this feeling, they're often quite correct. So think about that. Like, he's talking about ordinary people. He's up at an Ivy League university, and these snooty eggheads are like, ordinary people vote against their best interests, so I have no sympathy for them. We probably all heard that, right? Particularly now. Like, um, again, there's going to be political discussions in this class. That's just the nature of a course on globalization and justice. No getting around it, but we can handle it as adults and handle it more importantly as sociologists. So we hear a lot of this stuff aimed at Trump supporters, right? Um, well, maybe the Trump supporters feel as though their lives are a series of traps, right? And C. Wright Mills is like, you know what? You're probably right. And then he goes on to say, the more aware they become, however vaguely, of ambitions and of threats which transcend their immediate locales, the more trapped they seem to feel. This really resonates with this class. Globalization. I mean, think about this. You, I'm sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Let me turn this off. Apologies for that. So, there's a process that a sociologist named Anthony Giddens describes as distanciation. So something so far removed from me and it's so vague and big, I have no control over it. Something like a recession. I mentioned that in our first presentation. I had no control over what was happening on Wall Street. I lost my job nonetheless, so I'm like, well, that feels like a trap. That's a big trap. And what do I do about it? I mean, I'll admit then I voted for Obama. You know what he did? Issued golden parachutes for all the people that got us in that mess. So the more um aware I became of the problem, the more trapped I seemed to feel. You see? Because the ambitions and threats transcended my immediate locale. I couldn't do anything in Franklin, Tennessee about this. I mean, people, of course, like mobilized into Occupy Wall Street. We'll talk about that later in the semester. But frankly, that did very, very little to impact these public issues. Mills goes on to say the very shaping of history now outpaces the ability of people to orient themselves in accordance with cherished values. This is another sentiment that we may attribute to um, conservatives. So we'll talk about this, a quick aside with these political terms: conservative, liberal, progressive. We'll get clear on some of these terms because these are also labels that get extremely distorted in the mainstream um, discourse. But conservative, for the time being, we just mean somebody who's trying to maintain the inertia of the status quo. So maintaining, conserving the present, right? We don't want things to change too fast because we may unravel the fabric of society itself. If we transform um, something like a social institution, the family, we start tinkering with the social institution of the family and traditionally gender assigned family roles, then everything's going to break down. That's the idea. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. This is a very structural functionalist approach. If you're familiar with that paradigm within sociology, these social structures serve a function. The family structure serves a function, and to tinker with it may lead to instability. right? Disorder. And we're all about order. Social institutions structure, they order our lives. So like thinking about what Mills is saying here, the very shaping of history, the type of world we live in now outpaces the ability of people to orient themselves in accordance with cherished values. So the name of the game of modern society is transformation and change. But a lot of our values are rooted in medieval values and even classical antiquity. I mean, the Bible, was written by the ancients. It was, canonized in the late ancient, early medieval period. But these are values that are um, have a long distance temporally from us. So if things are changing so quickly, and our values just can't keep up with it. So think about why it is like older people who are more rigid and less capable of change get so angry, and maybe why they disproportionately gravitate towards more conservative ideological perspectives, right? Mills is saying this doesn't make someone bad or dumb. This makes them a human, right? He's like, we're social scientists here. Let's figure this out. He goes on to say, perhaps the most fruitful distinction with which the sociological imagination works is between the personal troubles of milieu and the public issues of social structure. So I've already used this language a little bit in this presentation. The personal troubles thing. Like, think about that whenever you read this. Hopefully, you've read it. He spends a lot of time talking about this because he's setting the stage for the rest of his book, of course, and how it relates to his other category of public issues. So, a quick aside, I have found that I read Mills far differently than my colleagues, even my former advisor, John Scheffner. And so I have a lot of his notes on the sociological imagination, and he and virtually all my colleagues that I can think of, they think that personal troubles are just something that happened to you, like you had a flat tire, who cares? And then public issues is something big, like, um, you know, after this Randy Boyd audit, the University of Tennessee shuts down. Oh gosh, that's going to screw me up. I'm not going to have an education. But it was outside of my control. Well, I found through this meme that no, somebody reads Mills the same way as I do. I don't always have personal troubles, but when I do, I prefer connecting them to public issues. So let me clarify like my reading. First of all, why would he spend so much time talking about personal troubles in this book if he's just like, yeah, and we can ignore that? No, 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 no. He's saying if we have a personal trouble, if we identify a personal trouble in our research, it's the job of the sociologist equipped with the sociological imagination to identify how that's related to a public issue. And if it's not related to a public issue, then it's not of sociological importance. You getting a flat tire, that's not of sociological importance. Let's see if I can clarify this more with the next two or three slides. So this is a larger quote. I usually don't do this, and for some reason I have an icon that I can't move that's right on top of it. Wonderful. Um, Let me see if I can. Well, I'll try to try to make do. Sorry, guys. Still new experience for me. What we experience in various and specific milieu, I have noted, is often caused by structural changes. Accordingly, to understand the changes of many personal milieu, we are required to look beyond them. And the number and variety of such structural changes increase as the institutions within which we live become more embracing and more intricately, is that what it says, connected with one another. To be aware of the idea of social structure, this is another one's blocked, something to use it with sensibility is to be capable of tracing such linkages among a great, I might say number of milieu, sorry, that's where icons over that side. To be able to do that is to possess the sociological imagination. So here's how I apply it. Troubles, these personal troubles. Like I said, to me, he's not talking about you getting a flat tire. Troubles occur within the character of the individual and within the range of their immediate relations with the others. They have to do with the individual and with those limited areas of social life of which one is directly and personally aware. Okay, great. So, issues, on the other hand, have to do with matters that transcend these local environments of the individual and the range of one's inner life. They have to do with the organization into the institutions of a historical society as a whole. An issue is a public matter. So, getting back to this, like how I piece these things together. If you've had me for theory and maybe even other classes, my emphasis on dialectics, this is a dialectic going on here. And this is why contemporary sociologists uh, misread this. They collapse it into two non dialectical categories, two discrete categories. That's not how the dialectic works. So, okay, here's my example that I've given over the years. So let's look at this guy who's struggling with addiction. The tendency in our country is to blame the victim, right? This bum, he's had all these opportunities and he's just drunk all the time, lost his house, lost his job, um, his wife left him, that kind of thing. You're like, he's just selfish. He had every opportunity afforded to him. And I don't feel sorry for the guy. Well, C. Wright Mills is saying for the sociologists, let's see what's going on here. So, two different examples of something that happened on a really large scale. COVID. Alcohol consumption went through the roof during COVID. People were sheltering in place, bored, alone, um, and they consumed a bunch of alcohol. The other one, the classic example I've given for years, is the Great Recession. Because as I've said, that impacted me. I mean, I lost my job. I went to grad school. I had some, you know, safety nets in place where I could stay afloat, but other people didn't. So maybe what we see is this guy on the previous slide. He goes to college. He, does really, really well. He graduates, gets a good job, meets a woman who also has a good job. Things are going well. They get engaged. They do the whole thing. They get married. They have a kid. Things are looking great. And then, bam, 2008 hits. Great Recession. He's laid off. She's laid off. There's a lot of financial pressure within the household. Um, he starts drinking. She becomes more and more frustrated with their relationship in terms of the problem drinking, the financial strain, and she leaves him. He eventually loses his house. And once the economy is stabilized, he was never able to, um, you know, obtain comparable employment. And now he's dealing with the additional problems, to use, or troubles, to use Mills's language, the additional troubles of abuse, alcohol abuse, and an issue of like trying to find employment and housing. So this is what he's doing. You see, it's like, all right, how are these two things related? Now, sociologists, including Mills, will certainly concede that there are people out there that will see. I live Fourth and Gill, right off Broadway. There's a homeless encampment near me, and people blame the victim all the time. They're all there because of drug and alcohol and prostitution and things that they've done to themselves. Well, Mills was like, let's hold on here. I mean, some of these people I've talked to, the older ones, are veterans of the Vietnam War. They were veterans of uh, the Persian Gulf War. These kind of things. Like let's see if we can make sense of this. Are there some homeless people that have been afforded every opportunity and they just squandered it? Sure, but that's something that we need to consider. And once we've identified that, then that's not of sociological interest. Maybe it's psychological, probably is, but it's not the domain of sociology. Hopefully that's clear. So people with values supported by society experience well-being. People with values unsupported by um, by society experience crisis. People whose values are neither supported nor unsupported experience indifference. Some people may not have any deeply held values to begin with. They experience uneasiness. I used to spend a lot more time on this section. I did a lot more social psychology when I was younger, but I've definitely moved more to a macro perspective. So I just wanted to note that, and maybe it'll come up in some of our readings down the line. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out here. But we're going to move on to the next section. Okay, so again, trying to tie this to like current events. That's why we're here, right? And he's talking about life being a series of traps and things being removed from us. Globalization. I mean, there's things that are happening in China, obviously, that are affecting your life, and you're like, well, what can I do about it? I mean, Marsha Blackburn talks about it all the time. Maybe I vote for her and she can do something about it. But that's the kind of uneasiness, the the the, the even apathy that we might feel. So the significance of public issues is that they are rooted in social conditions. The sociological imagination helps us um, hone. I'm sorry, that's where the icon is. Sensitive helps us something sensitive to the differences between the two. Helps us think of remedies. Right. So that's the thing. Like especially sociology today, we have this whole like emphasis on public sociology, and as did C. Wright Mills, that's why he calls it the promise. He's like, well, we shouldn't just like study people like lab rats, like the people that are participating in our research are people, and we should use the sociological imagination in order to develop good research designs that enable us to collect and analyze reliable data. But he's like, what do we do with that data? He's like, this data should be used in turn to help us think of remedies, intervention strategies within society. So his book actually landed on the desk of John Kennedy, and it helped kind of spark his um, War on Poverty, along with a book by Michael Harrington, The Other America. So these ideas did have some impact, and this is what people like C. Wright Mills want us to do. And this isn't something that's going to violate what I've been saying about our apolitical approach to sociology. Not at all. Sociology, again, was born out of the crucible of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. And basically, these Enlightenment thinkers thought, well, if the material world, the physical world, is now amenable to human understanding through the physical sciences, we can apply that same scientific approach to understanding society, much like a physician. So let's understand what makes a healthy human specimen. So whenever we see symptoms of an illness, we'll be able to correctly diagnose that illness and treat the cause and not just treat the symptom. That's what Mills has inherited here from the more utopian sociologists of the 19th century. So our assignment for week 1, the discussion forum. You see these questions. So again, go to Canvas, the left column under discussion. It's also located under assignments. It's also located under the week 1 module. You'll answer each of these questions. Why are you here? The follow-up questions. What do you want to get out of the university experience, et cetera, et cetera. And the class is, I think we have around 30 students, if I'm not mistaken. So I think what I'll do is, instead of responding directly to the discussion board, I'll pull out some of the responses from my next lecture next week. I won't spend a lot of time because we have a lot of terrain to cover next week, but I'll follow up on some of this because I've thought about going through like I did earlier in this lecture and answering some of these questions the way that students have answered it in the past. But since this is an actual assignment, I'm not going to do that. I'll just follow it up like Monday or Tuesday, see how you guys are responding to it, talk through it, see if there's any hiccups. I think the way that this assignment is designed is for us to pretty much, with like sort of impossible to not answer these questions correctly because they're very, very opinion oriented, right? But we'll get back to that. So the summary, we're almost done. I know this was kind of a long lecture, particularly for it being online. Mills tells us that we need to know history's long-term effect of social structures, both now and in the past, to understand our biography. Again, individual lives. Only in this way can we obtain a sociological perspective. So why do we need this again? It offers us a tool to understand the difference between personal troubles and public issues, and I would add, and how they're related. Using the sociological imagination means trying to understand how society is currently structured, how and why things are currently changing, how our own personal biography fits within the structure and trends of change. But structure, history, and social groups are not all determining. The sum of our social characteristics and history does not sufficiently define us, but it gives us knowledge and perspective. So we're trying to recontextualize that puzzle piece, trying to see the big picture. Excuse me, I'm still struggling with these allergies. Knowing the roots of problems help us identify shared experiences and circumstances and find ways where people working together can exert some control over these situations. It redirects our attention to more productive analyses and strategies for social change. So finally, structure is pattern. It's not inevitable. That's what I meant by that feedback. So we're structured by social institutions, but we're also making them. You see? So that's how we have social change. This skill is crucial for understanding politics. It allows us to understand economic and political trends, which may be behind rhetoric. And yeah, I found out how to get rid of that icon so I can actually read this part. Helps us understand why certain issues are highlighted while others are not discussed. So that's a big one for this class in particular. Hopefully, some of you have had my 321 class where we talked about Max Weber and his political sociology. It really, really helps guide this course for me. And so this last point, if you recall, has to do with agenda setting. And if you haven't had that class, it's okay. We'll return to that later. But that's our first rather lengthy lecture of the semester. Hopefully you made it through it. Make sure you participate and submit those responses to the discussion forum. As I said, I'll read from some of them to make sure that we're all on the same page early next week. And then we'll get into our next section very quickly, into section 2 of our syllabus. What is globalization?